The relationship between the United States and North Korea has been a complex and volatile aspect of international politics characterized by periods of intense hostility and tentative diplomacy. At the heart of this dynamic lies the issue of nuclear deterrence. North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons has been driven by a desire to ensure regime survival and deter perceived threats primarily from the United States. I'm here at the East-West Center in Washington, D.C. to attend a discussion led by experts like Frank Ohm, Marcus Kaluska, and Jenny Tao.
Right, self-defense is one of the notions, but certainly, as we've discussed already, there are other reasons as well. Coercive means, as well as even the prestige of joining the nuclear club, given the fact that, would we treat North Korea the way we do if they didn't have nuclear weapons? Would the U.S. pay attention to North Korea at all if they didn't have nuclear weapons? And I think, we know the answer to that. So, this is a situation where if we're looking for easy answers, we're not going to find them. And I think we spend too much time looking for easy answers. I think at the end of the day now, North Korea has gotten to a point where they have an extensive WMD program. And so the nature of the challenge that North Korea's WMD program faces is fundamentally different from when we started paying attention, right? So back in the 1990s, in the first round of negotiations of the Great Framework, this was a non-proliferation challenge. We were trying to prevent North Korea from going nuclear. Well, that ship has sailed, right? North Korea has nuclear weapons. They have delivery systems. We can discuss of like what's for show, what's for, how much is being developed versus actually deployed, and how much is being proliferated, how much is for sales, all of these different questions, right? But they definitely have capabilities that are concerning. But the way we approach North Korea is the same as the way we approached North Korea in the 1990s, as a non-proliferation challenge, and then we wonder why we're not making progress. So I think the reality is right now what North Korea poses in sort of a broader perspective is for the United States, this is a real challenge of a non-peer nuclear adversary. So we're used to dealing with China and Russia. We're willing to do things with China and Russia because they are a big power, because of they're worthy of big power status. What we are not willing to do is to treat North Korea in the same way. And that limits our diplomatic choices of how we deal with North Korea, even though now they have nuclear weapons. And this is something that I think is just a fundamental challenge that the U.S. is going to have to deal with, as to what is our goal now for this non-peer nuclear adversary. If we really want them to denuclearize, then we need to figure out how to create a diplomatic environment where that's a viable option. Because trying to intimidate North Korea into denuclearization, or just assuming they're going to choose that at some point, I don't think is realistic. But I do want to say also that North Korea's, as North Korea's capabilities has grown, their strategy has evolved, right? So it isn't where it was under Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong-un definitely has a different strategy. He definitely has a different approach to development. And I think we've seen, the nuclear doctrine really evolve to be more of an actual doctrine, to tell us more about their strategy. But we're seeing also their talk about war evolve as well. So, this has been the debate of like the terminology coming up now, the difference between North Korea using the terms combat readiness versus war readiness, war preparedness, and what does that mean? Does it mean they're actually preparing to start a war? Does it mean they're actually better preparing to endure a war? And how is war readiness in the North Korean context different than war readiness in the South Korean context? We talk about war readiness all the time, right? We assume, even though we talk about needing to be ready for war, that North Korea knows we're not trying to start a war. But when North Korea talks about war readiness, we assume they probably want to start a war. Is that the right assumption? And I think those are all the questions that we're grappling with here, because we don't have access, because we don't have diplomacy right now, and because it takes two to have a negotiation, and it takes two to have diplomacy. And I think this is the other challenge, is because we haven't figured out yet what are realistic objectives for U.S.-DPRK relations. It's very hard to create a proposition to get them back to negotiations to begin with.
Excellent, very well said. Well, now that in the first round, all the panelists have had an opportunity to throw cold water on the premise of my questions, we can move on to the next one. This begs the question, so what now? And just to couch us in the present moment in terms of the diplomatic endeavors, Mira Rapp-Hooper, a State Department official, went on an interview with CSIS and offered interim steps. They said that this wasn't new, but it kind of felt like something new to us on the outside, trying to emphatically state that there is something that we can achieve that will have some reciprocity in the middle of the deal, rather than just putting the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow of denuclearization, but also very much in step with what the Trump administration was doing and what prior administrations had done, the parallel and synchronous nature. And yet North Korea has just totally been radio silent, right? Throughout the entire Biden administration. So this begs the question of why, and then what should we do? And I'll offer up a couple of different ideas and see if you agree with any of these, or judging by the way that you've all responded to the first round of questions, I think you'll probably disagree with everything I have to say, but let's see. Are they waiting for Trump, right? They can squeeze a good deal out of Trump. Are they waiting for a better offer? Do they want de facto recognition as a nuclear, or de jure recognition as a nuclear power, and will only negotiate on the terms of an arms control agreement rather than denuclearization? They're just unwilling to accept that premise. I think that it would be very difficult for a U.S. president to abandon the goal of denuclearization, but I leave it to you to disagree with me there. Is North Korea waiting to hit certain weapons development milestones where they can say, okay, now we feel like we finally have what we need to enter into negotiations? Or, and this is something that has been a big topic of discussion, have the geopolitics shifted so dramatically that North Korea no longer prioritizes its relationship with the United States as it once did? So that's some food for thought on the table, but I'm really hungry to hear what you have to say. We'll go the opposite direction this time, so Jenny, you're up first.
All the easy questions, right? So, one, the idea that we throw out hey, we can get back to nuclear negotiations anytime, anywhere, assumes North Korea wants to talk about denuclearization and wants to negotiate away its nuclear weapons program. Obviously, they don't. They've literally said a line has been crossed, the time is passed. Not only do they have the new nuclear law, but they've also enshrined in their constitution now both the right and the mandate to continue developing WMD. So, whatever was low-hanging fruit before and the opportunity that existed before has fundamentally changed, right? Even when North Korea talks about its nuclear weapons program, it used to couch it in conditionalities, right? As long as the U.S. maintained its hostile policy, it needed a nuclear program. All that conditionality is gone in the rhetoric now. So they consider themselves a responsible nuclear state. They're not looking for a recognition of that. They recognize themselves. And their friends now, like for instance, Russia says, well, they have nuclear weapons. They don't need security guarantees. They have their own nuclear weapons. And as long as people are willing to deal with them in that sense, what do they need from the U.S.? What is the U.S. realistically, credibly going to offer them that's going to be better than what they're getting right now, right? I do think 2019 was a very consequential milestone in U.S.-DPRK relations. And if you look at how Kim Jong-un approached the negotiations, he took a lot of political risks to do what he did. Not only did they do unilateral steps up front in order to paved the way for negotiations and paved the way for a different relationship, but he really built up domestic expectation that it was coming. You know, that there was going to be this big breakthrough and that it was going to benefit the North Korean people. And when you raise that kind of expectation and then come home with nothing, it was, you know, a very humiliating and very humbling moment for him, I think. And one there that the calculation then fundamentally changed also of what was possible, especially within a reasonable amount of time that would bring about results that he could take credit for. And I think what you've seen since then is a real shift in foreign policy strategy away from trying to negotiate with stubborn states like the United States and South Korea, where everything is kind of hard fought. And you know, with a very low proposition of actual results, outcomes and results that may or may not be sustainable over time, versus cultivating relations with countries that are willing to work with them regardless of sanctions and regardless of the political environment. And it just, you know, the pandemic helped create an opportunity for North Korea to kind of reset, isolate itself and reset its priorities, reset its propaganda, reset its, reset its relationship with South Korea, and crack down on civil society to say that, South Korea is bad again. Everything that happened in 2018 of opening up and having like K-pop exhibitions in Pyongyang and Moon Jae-in in Pyongyang giving a speech to a live audience and going to Mount Paektu, like all of that was over, and they had to reinstill those traditional propositions and values in society. But it also helps that the geopolitical situation fundamentally changed also. So you have like US-China rivalry, big power competition. You have, North Korea was one of the first countries to really embrace the idea that there was an emerging new Cold War, and one that really benefited North Korea by having greater political value on the other side of that Cold War, right? So, I think all of these conditions created a real opportunity for North Korea to reset, shift, and move, barrel forward with a very different strategy, and one where they could keep their weapons, one where they could gain recognition and gain status within, that other side of the Cold War bloc, and really then cultivate new friends that were willing to work with them on their own terms. And so I think until we have a situation where that geopolitical situation shifts to one where, if we ever got back to like the kind of unanimity that existed in 2017 about, the pariah status that North Korea had at that time, that would really, kind of force their hand on that, and they wouldn't have the partners that would be willing to work with them, given their reputational status. I think it's very hard to see where that new diplomatic opportunity comes from the US, especially if our messaging is still denuclearization centered.
Very well stated, Jenny. And it's hardest to go first. So well done. And I think it's really well said that this is a problem set that's deeply rooted in regional rivalry. And without addressing the regional rivalry, we'd be foolhardy to expect a quick and easy solution through some handy diplomacy. Just send in our best negotiators and they'll be able to get it done, right? Frank, over to you.
Yeah, so I think the answer is all of the above. They are waiting for Trump. Trump was the first US sitting president to meet with the North Korean leader. He gave them 3 summits. They are waiting for a better offer, especially if you give any weight to rumors out there. There's a political article 3 months ago that said that Trump was considering a new approach to North Korea that ends at just a nuclear freeze and not going to complete denuclearization. They quoted Alex Ward quoted 3 sources. If Kim Jong-un is reading that article, he's probably thinking, okay, I'm going to wait, right? They are waiting to complete their military milestones, and certainly the geopolitics have shifted, right? North Korea is not in an urgent, desperate situation. They're getting a lot of the nutritional energy, military assistance from China and Russia that they're looking for. So I think the fact that you can come up with all these potential reasons, these exhaustive reasons why North Korea may be radio silent, reinforces the idea that yes, they are in a good position where they can wait a little bit longer, at least 9 months to a year, to see if the security environment has changed to their advantage, right? I'm curious about what will happen in a year from now, regardless of whether it's a new Trump administration or a second Biden term, because we can test hypotheses about what North Korea says that they want, right? Because I don't know if you recall, but I want to say last November, the U.S. had reiterated its offer of unconditional talks, and this is what Kim Yo-jong responded, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she basically said, "We are no longer willing to engage with the United States as long as our sovereignty," read as denuclearization, is on the agenda, right? But they've made this claim before, right? They've said, 10 years ago that they would never give up their treasured sword, and then they signed a Singapore statement where one of the pillars was complete denuclearization, right? So I'm curious to see, for example, if Trump wins and he wants to re-engage, will North Korea re-engage with the United States under the Trump administration with denuclearization being on the agenda? Then again, if that happens, then I don't know how seriously you can take some of North Korea's comments, because they keep on being very equivocal about it, right? Another point I'll make is that a few of us were in a meeting with the NSC. It was Chatham House, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That means I shouldn't acknowledge we were there the other day.
Okay. So I can say without naming individuals, I asked a question about whether the U.S. offer was really unconditional, right? Because if the U.S. will not agree to summit level talks first, and they insist on working level talks first, that's a precondition, right? And the NSC official basically said, okay, yeah, well, I guess that is a precondition, because we couldn't do a summit level talk right off the bat. We need to start with working level talks. And then I said, if denuclearization has to be on the agenda, that is a precondition, right? And then this official said, well, we've expressed our interest or willingness to have talks with North Korea without denuclearization being on the agenda, at least initially, right? So I'm really interested to see what happens a year from now. I mean, we're sort of in this dead stalemate period, and I don't see much interesting happening over the next few months, but there's going to be more opportunities over the next year.
Thanks so much, Frank. So much to think about. I recall a Kim Yo-jong statement, I'm not sure if it was the same one, where she called America's offers slender tricks for earning time because they were all reversible, right? We always talk about irreversible denuclearization, and they said, well, suspending military exercises, that's reversible. Suspending sanctions, that's reversible. So she kind of flipped the logic and threw it back on America's face, but I agree with you that the point of a lot of Kim Yo-jong's statements has been to raise the bar for what talks will need to be premised upon. And then the other really valuable question that you brought up is, whose side is time on right now? And if you look at how much North Korea might have earned from its armaments exports to Russia, yeah, I've seen ballparks, and who knows, right? We don't really know. But I've seen a ballpark at 1 billion. North Korea's total exports were something on the order of 250 million the year prior. So they're earning 4 times the total amount of their exports through arms deals with Russia. That's a lot of padding. That's a lot of extra time. And cyber, right? Not to forget cyber. So that's some more things to think about. Marcus, over to you.
All right, so since I'm going now after the first round, I do want to revisit just real quickly a couple of issues. So I want to correct the record, Frank, on something you said, because you blended the defensive and the coercive, and actually those are very distinct in the way the NIA describes them.
It was intentional.
Yeah, it was intentional. So, Anyway, I won't take debate on that one. But to be clear, the coercive scenario is judged in the NIE as high. Defensive and offensive are both described as low, and there is a very clear distinction between defensive, and the difference is with coercive use, Kim Jong-un is employing threats, including nuclear threats, and possibly limited use of military force to achieve objectives, whereas the defensive purpose does not include using military force and involves willingness to engage in sincere confidence-building measures, et cetera. So I think there is a distinction, is I think a North Korea that is in many ways on the defensive is still using offensive tools and coercive tools to achieve its goals. And so when people ask me, why would North Korea attack if their goal is regime survival? Well, you don't survive by remaining in a crouch and huddling into a ball, right? North Korea sees, I think, doctrinally, ideologically, and just practically, that offensive action is part of its strategy and its strategic DNA for how it survives. And then, but I think the other thing on deterrence is I really do firmly believe in the context of diplomacy that strengthened deterrence is vital, actually, not just maintaining deterrence, but strengthened deterrence is vital to actually have a hope of diplomatic success. Because as long as North Korea feels that it can, or assesses, Kim Jong-un assesses that he can achieve his goals through coercion, or perhaps even through offensive use someday, then what's the point of making a deal, right? Unless it's just a temporary, kind of, to buy time. But I think the point is well taken on some of the things that we do for deterrence purposes are so focused on the image of retribution, of potentially even preemption, but certainly have they play into North Korea's hands sometimes by providing a pretext for North Korea to say it's being threatened, because the focus is on deterrence by punishment, including by explicit threats to the leadership, right? When you have when the central element of your approach to deterrence messaging is, if you do X, we will bring an end to your regime, it does kind of play into their narrative that we're trying to end their regime. And so I think there are ways, and I've written about them, and I won't go, pontificate on them here in detail, to strengthen deterrence in ways that are long overdue, without playing into the offensive narrative, without further sort of encouraging North Korea to portray itself as being under imminent threat, by focusing more on approaches to be resilient in the face of North Korean attack, to be able to fight North Korea at varying levels of the spectrum, and then also to minimize the risk, and this is why I think this distinction between coercion and defense is so important, is to minimize the risk that coercion ends up veering into a scenario of nuclear war, because I think coercion can very quickly, in a limited military conflict, veer into a situation where North Korea decides, for very rational reasons, that the best way for the regime to survive is to use nuclear weapons in a limited attack. And so when people say, oh, it's just coercive, the coercive pathway is probably the one that gets you more likely to a nuclear war than the offensive pathway, because deterring an offensive is actually fairly straightforward in my view, right? But deterring coercion, pretty difficult. And then you have to engage in intra-conflict deterrence once that conflict starts, and then you have to engage in diplomacy as well to try and de-escalate the conflict. And of course, we've talked about why diplomacy is so hard. So that is a way of backing into this discussion.
Can you just tell us, folks,
Sure.
many folks probably